Hi, everyone, and welcome to the Still Loading podcast. I am delighted to be introducing you to my guest today. Now, Melissa came via the London Writers Salon, which is another episode if you're interested. But Melissa Romo is actually looking at the topic that this whole podcast is about. So it's exploring leadership for the digital age, as you know, and Melissa's been doing exactly just that. Now, she is in a global role for Sage, if I remember correctly, and has been also, whilst doing her full-time job, working on writing this book, which will be out in April for whenever your ears hear this episode. That'll be April 2023. And I can't wait to read more of it and to get my hands on her insights and wisdom. But Melissa, could you tell everyone a little bit more about yourself, please?
Of course. It's great to be here, Ilona. Thank you for the invitation. I'm really looking forward to our conversation. So I am a 30-year veteran of marketing and advertising, and actually my first love is marketing and advertising. I discovered it in college, and I was fascinated by the psychology of words and images being able to, and ideas being able to make people do things. And so I got into it many decades ago, and I'm still in it. And you're right, I am in a global role, marketing role for Sage. And my career has actually almost always been global. I worked in Eastern Europe briefly, launching products for Procter and Gamble during the post-Berlin Wall years. And I love global business. I'm actually in global business because I did not score well enough on the State Department's entrance exam to become a Foreign Service officer. So I didn't do well enough to move on to the next stage and becoming a Foreign Service officer. So I thought, well, okay, how else can I do it? So I went into global business and global marketing. So I really think of myself as a bit of a diplomat in the
Yep.
business world, and relationships are super important to me, and building teams is a super important part of my job today and has been for a while. And yeah, that's basically me, the diplomat in in a suit.
I think, to be honest, as well, with the whole diplomacy thing, at least you're doing it at a faster pace, right? Because I know within the Foreign State Department, and I used to work in the Foreign State Department for the UK, and I tell you now, the pace is a lot slower than global business. So,
Yeah.
global business is a great space to be in. And I'd love you to share a little bit about your book, your upcoming book that is going to be put in the press as we speak, but it would be great to share a bit more with the audience about what it's about.
Yes. So thank you. I wrote a book called Your Resources Human: How Empathetic Leadership Can Help Remote Teams Rise Above. So it is about remote teams and what a leader can do to bring empathy into their leadership, wheelhouse, toolbox, whatever you want to call it, to truly help remote teams gel and function like a team. And I approach this as someone who is both a remote worker, because I've been working for Sage remotely since the beginning of 2017. And before that, actually, I was remote off and on in different jobs. And all the time I was remote because I was at a lot far distance from my company's office. So that was driving me being remote. It was just too far for me to get to the company's office. And there are different reasons that people are remote today, but that's why I have always been remote. So when the pandemic happened, I had been remote for quite a long time. And, I feel guilty saying this, but actually the pandemic was the best thing that ever happened to me as a remote worker, because suddenly everybody else was also remote,
Yeah.
so I didn't feel, before the pandemic, less than 5% of the global knowledge workforce was ever working remote. So it was a really unusual thing to be doing, even though we had all the technology and we had the, broadband and we had Zoom and everything before the pandemic. It really wasn't something that a lot of people were doing, right? So I remember, there are people I know in my town who are in my friend circle, and we talk about work, and I'd say I work from home, and they would say, "Oh, you work from home," with like the quote marks, the air quotes,
Oh,
right?
they always come out,
And
don't
it
they,
would
these quote
drive
marks?
me crazy. I'm like, yes, in fact, I do work, work from home, and it's a lot, and there'll be hours and hours at a stretch when I don't even stand up, because when you work from home, you don't have to stand up. You just keep switching calls, and that's it. So working from home is really intense, and no one seemed to think that I was really working, right? Which always aggravated me. So when the pandemic happened and suddenly everybody went home, I thought, wow, this is amazing. Thank God everyone understands how it feels. So one of the reasons I wrote the book is, although I think we all got home and sort of began to understand how it feels, I don't think we really talked about the downsides of remote work, because we tend to talk about how great it is. You get the flexibility, you don't have to commute, you get some time back in your day to do things that you want to do personally. And those are all really positive things. And I fully agree with them, and I benefit from them too. But there still are downsides, right? There are things like paranoia, which is something I researched in the book, right? Out of sight, out of mind. Do people still know I'm here? Do people know what I do? Have people heard of my projects, right? Do you know? We even if it's only subconsciously, that's all sort of churning in our head. Is this like very low level paranoia? And that's what I was feeling. And so I researched it, and turns out there's like loads of reasons that we all feel paranoid, and that's in the book. I also had moments where I felt really lonely. And this is something that does kind of come up with remote work, but again, we sort of gloss over it and say, well, we're lonely, but we love the flexibility, so we're going to be remote anyway. So I wanted to dig into that. Are we really lonely? Is this a problem? You know, what makes us lonely? Is it enough that we're spending more time with our friends, even though we're not in person with our workmates? And it turns out that it's not. That's not enough. We actually need to see our workmates, right? Our friends can't substitute for our workmates. So I thought that was interesting, and I researched everything around loneliness, what's driving it, how we feel it, and all of this stuff. And then there's three other things I also researched, which are boredom and guilt and depression. So the whole first half of the book is about those five, what I call emotional pitfalls of remote work. And I remember telling my publisher, you know, this is a downer. Like, who's gonna want to sit and read this book? And she's like, well, just be honest. Like, this is kind of tough stuff, but this is the stuff. Do you remember that scene in Jerry Maguire where he says, he's writing his manifesto, and he says, the things we think and do not say, right? And that whole monologue he has at the beginning of the movie, where he writes his manifesto because it's all about the things we think and do not say. So the first half of this book are the things we think and feel and do not say, right? That's the whole manifesto for remote workers. So if you're listening to this and you're feeling any of these things, boredom, guilt, paranoia, depression, and loneliness, any of them, read the first half of the book, because what I hope happens is you feel seen. Like, you feel like, okay, this is normal that I feel this way. This is why I feel this way. I know that when I did the research for the book and I was finding these things, I was like, oh my God, now I know why. Now I know why I feel bored. And it isn't because my work is boring. It's because I'm sick of looking at my apartment, right? So there's reasons that we feel these things, and they all are very validating. And so I hope the first half of the book really validates for people how they feel. And I also want leaders to read it and empathize with the people working for them who are working remote, right? To read it and go, aha, okay, now I get how it feels. Because although many leaders do, and when I say leaders, I'm talking senior executives, C-level people, many of them are doing more of the hybrid thing where they're in the office and they're at home, but their heads and hearts are still in the building 9 to 5, right? It's like, it's a way of working and a way of life that I think they're never going to rinse their hands of it, right? That's the way they feel about work. So I want them to read this book and go, okay, that's how it feels to be at home, right? Or working remotely, or not in person. So they empathize. And then the second half of the book is, and I was alarmed because I broke one of Brene Brown's rules, which is you cannot have as a decision tree guide people around empathy. Like you cannot say, if a person feels A, then I should do B, right? You cannot have these decision trees around empathy, because empathy has to be very organic and you have to feel it. And so I broke that rule. And I created something called the Remote Leadership Wheel, which will be in the book. And the Remote Leadership Wheel takes those 5 emotions that I mentioned at the beginning, and it assigns what I call a counterpoint emotion, or like a counterbalanced emotion,
Yep.
right? So for example, if the person that works for you is exhibiting signs of boredom, or they talk about being bored, the counterpoint emotion to boredom is meaning, right? If someone is bored, then what they're lacking is meaning. They want their work to have more meaning, and they want to have that meaning spelled out for them. They want to be connected better to the company's purpose or to the team's purpose. And so there are things in the book that help you as a leader diagnose, is that their issue? Is that really what's pulling them down? And then how can I bring meaning into our conversations and into their regular work? So every one of those 5 sort of emotional pitfalls has an emotional counterweight, and the second half of the book helps you identify and then develop strategies that are, I hope, very accessible, right? How to bring meaning up in conversations, how to bring purpose up in conversations. Because I just find that we've talked for decades and decades about the importance of emotional intelligence and the importance of empathetic leadership, or what we call authentic leadership more recently. Like, we're all nodding our heads, right? Like, oh yeah, we have to be authentic leaders, we have to be empathetic leaders. But we don't just wake up and become these touchy-feely leaders, right? We just don't.
So no, it's about developing that skill set.
Yeah, and in fact, I went through business school 20 years ago, which is like horrifying to say that it was 20 years ago, but I went to business school 20 years ago. This was before broadband, before smartphones, and before social media. So you almost think, were we like writing on tablets or something? It was a long time.
Yeah, like stone and chisel.
So much, yeah, chiseling on tablets. So when I was in business school, my favorite courses were organizational behavior. And even in those classes, however, the classes focused a lot on the nuts and bolts of organizations and how they operate and how they behave. And, things like communication were very important. And so we talked a lot about how to be a good communicator, and values and things like that were important. But after I left business school, one of my favorite professors was Sigal Barsaid, who was a professor at Yale School of Management, where I went. She left Yale and she went to Wharton, and she began this really in-depth study of love at work and what she called companionate love. And companionate love is the love that we feel most frequently, right? Most often. It's the love we feel between friends. It can be the love we feel even between co-workers who we've had for a very long time. It could be even love between aunts and uncles and cousins and stuff like that. So that type of love, she studied it. She actually studied it within companies, and looked at when that emotion is present, how does that change the outcomes for the team? Right? And she found all of this insight around the fact that people feel more invested in the team's mission. People feel more accountable for what the company is trying to do, right? People feel more accountable to customers, right? When there's companionate love in the team. So she did all this incredible research about love, but it was still after I went to business school with her. So it's really very recent, like her particular body of research around companionate love. And so I do talk about that in the book too, because we tend to think, and she talks about this in she has a very good talk on YouTube. We tend to think that emotions are the opposite of rational thought, right? And when we're in business, we have to be very rational, and we have to be focused on our rational thought processes. And if we're emotional, then that's the opposite, and that's not a good idea. And she basically smashes that opposition of those two things. And she says in lots of her research and her talk, she says emotions are rational thought. Like they're actually data. They give us information. They tell us things about the people that we're working with and we're collaborating with, and we should use that information, right, to then behave in a way that's going to ultimately advance the company's mission or what their team is trying to accomplish. And so that's how I handle it in the book. Is I say, okay, if this is happening, if people feel these things, this is data, this is information, so let's lay it down and then decide, what do we do, what action do we take as leaders now that we have that information?
Yeah, no, I think that's a great way of framing emotions, because you're right, this kind of concept of the rational, usually a man, right? The whole framework of economics was built on the concept of the rational man by Adam Smith, who was a confirmed bachelor and lived with his mother. So feminist economics actually says, actually, decisions aren't made like that in the family, which is kind of the general economic unit. It's actually different perceptions. So yeah, like challenging our own understanding of what emotions are and not discounting them and go, they don't give us information that's useful, but actually they give us a different type of information that's really valuable. And actually one of the things I've found when working with my clients is one of the game-changing bits of, like, one of the game-changing tools whenever we're working in remote leadership teams is, you know, the Gottman Institute, they've got like the wheel, like the emotions wheel, where we use like with teams to just help them to develop their emotional literacy, thinking about it as a way of understanding where they are, where their teams are, as an, you know, as you said, a data source. They love it. Their teams love it. So the more you can identify your emotions and really get quite specific on the data you're receiving, then the more information you can actually access in your own intuition, in your own sense of self, and your own emotional literacy just develops anyway.
Yeah, for sure.
It's just fascinating stuff.
Yeah, it really is. That's and that's where the book goes. I mean, I think we could all agree that we are never going back to Monday through Friday, 9 to 5 in an office building. Like, that's just never going to happen.
Sorry, Elon, not going to happen.
Yeah, not going to happen. There are too many other ways for people to find work, right? There's too many companies who are,
and there's too many successful people doing it now. There's too many successful
people doing it, and you know, there's all kinds of research data that says we're more productive when we're at home, and you know, the thing that I'm finding is when you talk to people about remote work and hybrid work, what they're dealing with now is going into the office part-time, and that actually impacting their ability to be productive. Right?
Yeah, right, because everyone's catching up.
Right. Now they're chatting, they're talking to people, there's more person-to-person time, which, you know, is a different way to be productive, right? And is an important component and ingredient of ultimately being successful as a team. So it is important that it's there. And actually, I'm very supportive of hybrid working. I think that's a really nice way to carry forward what we learned in the pandemic is a sort of hybrid work design where we're sometimes together and sometimes at home and we can focus. But yeah, when you put people in an office, I know I went a few weeks ago, I was in London and I was in the office. And it was like, I had, you know, in this 1.5 hour block, I had a Teams call. And then the next half-hour block, I was supposed to find someone in a conference room. And then the next hour block, I was supposed to go to someone's office on a different floor. And then there was a half-hour back on Teams. And I felt like I was in a spin dryer, right? I just didn't know which way I was going, right? So you aren't the same when you're in an office, right? You aren't as able to sort of, you know, switch, you know, call, right? And just kind of barrel through your day like that. And that's okay, right? Because doing that 5 days a week, I don't think is healthy, right? You don't, even just physically not healthy. You don't even stand up, right? So, you know, I think finding ways to mix time in person and time at home is a great solution. And what I see companies doing, and I think this is a really good thing, is companies are choosing their lane, right? Some companies are saying, you know what, we want to be always remote, right? People never have to come in, right? 100% remote. And some companies are saying, we want people to come in a couple days a week, right? And so they're coordinating what those days are and how that's going to work. And so in my mind, those are the two ways to do remote. It's either 100% or it's part of the time. And when you do all the surveys you look at globally of the workforce, the majority of people want hybrid, right? They
Hmm.
do want flexibility. They do want to be able to be at home some of the time, but not all of the time. 70, 80, 90% of people respond and say, I want hybrid. So what's important is for companies, I think, to choose a lane, right? So that people know when they take a job, the worst thing that can happen is you take a job for a company and then they haven't decided which kind of remote company they want to be. And then you find out the company is 100% remote and that isn't what you want and it doesn't make
Yeah.
you happy. And then I've even seen someone on LinkedIn say he was resigning because his company was 100% remote and he wanted to be able to be with people sometimes. So it's important right now for companies to just decide which one they're going to be.
Yeah, I think you have a really important point there because I think retention, especially in this labour market as it currently stands, the labour market's really competitive. And in terms of retention for companies, I think making those decisions and committing to them is going to be important to develop your retention strategy and also to think about, then planning. If you're hybrid, you're going to have a certain plan for retention than if you're completely remote. So one of my clients is a completely remote company, hence the remote leadership development. And what they do is they have a kind of away week for the whole company every half a year. And that's the way they, almost get that connection point. But it's, once every 6 months. So it's not as frequent as others, but some are more hybrid. But understanding that and understanding then to communicate the benefits and how you're going to develop people in those different types of environments, I think is important.
Yeah, definitely, definitely. And in all cases, whether you're hybrid or you're remote, you need leaders with different skills. You need
Mm.
leaders who understand the importance of every week having a one-on-one conversation, right? Or at least bi-weekly, having a one-on-one conversation. I was floored when the pandemic happened, and I don't remember where I read this, but I read this in, some leadership, it might have been Harvard Business Review or something, where people stopped having one-on-one conversations with their leaders. Leaders just disappeared. So this was alarming to me because people were just left alone, right? Like I remember talking to one person who's in my town who said she went 4 months without talking to her manager. I'm thinking, where's this manager, right? Are they tied up somewhere? So I mean, we need leaders with different skills, right? We can have the skills we had like when I went to business school, right?
Yeah.
We just need leaders with different skills, and we need leaders who, I write about proximity in the book, and there's something called proximity bias, which is an important concept to understand if you're managing two populations of the workforce, your in office workforce and your remote workforce, because there's a lot of data to show that your in office workforce will be treated preferentially to the remote workforce, and so that's called proximity bias. But there's a different proximity that I write about in the book, which is the fact that you and I are talking right now, and you may not know that I have another window open on my computer, and it is an email from a doctor giving me a test result that's really bad news, and I'm in the middle of reading it while our call is open, right? So, or I might have gotten a text message sitting here on my desk, and it's right in front of my face while I'm talking to you. So proximity, when we're working remotely and we're like this talking to each other, you're basically in my house, you're in my personal space, and there are things happening in my personal space that could have emotional repercussions on me, right? And you may not know that that's going on, but it's hitting me, and I'm trying to like keep myself in like a square box and like not react to it, but that's not normal. That's not what people are going to do. So I got some bad news during the COVID pandemic that I write about in the book, and my boss was right there, and I reacted to the bad news in front of my boss, and before I knew it, I had told him my news before I had even told my husband, right?
Mm.
Because he was right there. So, and it just, that's proximity is going to do that. So one of the things leaders need to be ready for is to be more a part of a person's home life, right? When there's a remote working situation, right? And to be ready for what you might learn about the person, or what you might see about the person, or what the person might tell you. Be ready to create boundaries where those need to be created, you know what I mean? And be ready to have some difficult conversations, or even just be ready to listen, right? Just to let the person know I'm here, and if you need an ear. or to know how to refer that person on if they need more professional help than you can give, because we're not psychiatrists. No one's asking us to be that. But we just have to be ready, because we're now in people's homes, and that takes a different type of leader.
Yeah, I can see that. And it's interesting because it touches on something I'm interested in, which is cyber psychology. And it's the idea that the design and interface of all the digital technology actually influences how we interact with each other. So one of the things that I read was about how the way that digital technology is, it lowers your inhibitions because of the way that you almost like talk to each other. And I can see that with digital technology, like your story, your inhibition was lowered because he was right there in front of you, and because of the different scenarios. But you can also see it as evidenced on like Twitter, where people go into a bit of a like, Twitter trolling fest and all the rest of it, or, unsolicited P pictures. You can work out what I'm talking about there. But what I mean is like those sorts of behaviours are very difficult to like replicate in real life without getting in a lot of trouble. I mean, thankfully the law's catching up with that now, but there is a sense of inhibition filters just reduced a lot because of digital technology, and understanding the cyber. I think leaders need to understand the cyber psychology of that as well. Like you said, to have those boundaries. One of the things that concerns me with certain people on the internet is that their boundaries are so blurred that they're almost like sharing everything to every forum in every way, because there is no filter. So as a leader, you almost have to say to yourself, okay, what am I comfortable sharing on this platform, that platform, and that platform? And these are my own personal boundaries, because otherwise it could get really messy really quickly, especially as you progress with your career. I think it's a really important thing for anyone in any sort of professional capacity to think about.
Yeah, for sure. 100%. 100%. Yeah, cyber psychology is a really, really big piece. That would have made my book too long, but
yeah, well, that's where my book comes in, I suppose.
Yeah.
It'll be the next bit. It'll be almost like the part two. But I'd love to talk to transition slightly to you and your own leadership journey. And I'd just love to hear about a leader that influenced you.
Yeah, I mean, there's a couple, and it's interesting because right now I'm reading a book, really good book about sponsorship. It's called Decoding Sponsorship by Maggie Chan and Brown. I'm going to be mad at myself that I don't have her full name. Maggie is her first name.
I will put it in the description box below. We will find it. Yeah.
Yeah. It's called Decoding Sponsorship. And she says in the book something that was a big light bulb for me. She said, women tend to be over mentored, but under sponsored. And what that means is we have lots of people kind of supporting us, as mentors and teaching us and showing us the path forward and so on and so forth. But a sponsor is someone who's willing to actually put their professional capital on the line to help advance a person's career. And so it's made me reflect a lot on people who have sponsored me. And, they're mostly men. There've been a couple of women who have sponsored me, but mostly men. I want to say I've had maybe 5 or 6 sponsors in my career. And every time my career moved on, it was because of a sponsor, right? Seeing an opportunity and deciding that I was right for it, and sort of, paving the way, I guess, or sort of opening the way for me to step into a new responsibility. And it's funny because I always felt uncomfortable about that, because they were mostly men. And I thought, do I need the big brother to help me like up the corporate ladder? I can't do that myself. I was very averse, in fact, to sponsorship. But having read her book, it's really helped me understand that that's how everybody does it, not just women, like men do that too. That's how everybody does it. And a sponsor, someone who's willing to put their political capital on the line for you, that's a big vote of confidence. It's a key ingredient to being successful. And, I'm hugely grateful for the people who've sponsored, there's 5 or 6 people who've sponsored me in my career. And I would say those are the leaders, that I will always remember. They created those inflection points in my career. Really. I mean, I had to be ready for it, and I had to, I had to step in and be successful. But they opened the door, and so I would say those leaders really influenced me. There's one leader who is not a sponsor of mine, but someone that I feel so passionately. I guess I feel like a follower of his, I guess is probably a good way to phrase it. And that's Ken Chenault, who was the CEO of American Express for many years. And he was the CEO of American Express when I worked at American Express. And I was right out of business school. I was a marketing director. So, I mean, he and I were never in the same meetings, obviously. I was just one of the 70,000 people who worked for him. But I do remember going to town halls. I worked in Manhattan in American Express's headquarters, global headquarters building. And I do remember going to town hall meetings that he would preside over. And, he would come in and he would talk to us about quarterly results or some new product launch or some big event or something like that. And he just had a way of addressing the room of thousands of people in this way that made you feel like he was just talking to you, right? He really felt it. His communication style was very intimate and very authentic. And I would also say, like, you felt the gravity of his conviction in every way. Every decision he made, everything he communicated. There was at one point where he had to talk about layoffs, and you felt the gravity of his commitment to what he had to do as a leader in a way that made you want to follow him, right? Because you knew he was fully in the boat, right? He was fully in the boat, in the same boat that you were in, and he believed in what he was doing, and the power of his conviction was so evident. And I just have everything that he's ever said or done, I have loved. I keep going on Amazon looking for the Ken Chenault biography. There is not one. Anyone out there who's in the market to write the Ken Chenault biography, go write it. And if you don't, I will write it. He is really incredible. And so, yeah, I mean, he's just really inspired me. And I do talk about him I write about him in the book. I tell a story about him in the beginning of my book. From September 11th, because that was a really pivotal moment for leaders in globally, not just in the United States, but him in particular. His global headquarters was across the street from the World Trade Towers, right? So he had to worry about people's lives, right? And I mean, he was front and center, and he did so many of the right things when that event happened. So yeah, I can't say enough good things. He was on a podcast with Carmelo Anthony this year, which is an amazing conversation. So
we will also put that link in the description box below.
Talking to Carmelo Anthony, and he says something really that I love. He says a leader's job is to define reality, but inspire hope. Something like that. Yeah. But define reality would inspire hope. So you can't run away from reality. Reality is what it is. You need to define it. You need to speak it out loud, but you need to inspire hope. And that's him in a nutshell.
Amazing. Well, thank you for that. I'd love to know a little bit as well about something about, your own experience of life that helped you on your leadership development journey. Like, what was something that happened to you that made you develop yourself as a leader?
I think I went to Poland when I was 26 years old, and as you do,
I went to Japan when I was 20, I think 21, something like that.
Yeah. I was working in New York City. I was working for Gray Advertising in Manhattan, and I was doing the whole Madison Avenue.
Living your best life.
Living my best life. It was like, Sex in the City, basically. It was, Friends. That was my life. And it was post-communism in Eastern Europe. It was the 90s. And, everybody seemed to be, not everybody, but, big chunks of people seemed to be just sort of migrating over to Eastern Europe to, bring capitalism to Eastern Europe. And I just thought this was fascinating, right? I just thought I need to do that. I need to be where that's happening. And so I spent about 18 months talking to Gray about the fact that I wanted to go to Eastern Europe and I wanted to support Procter and Gamble's brands in Eastern Europe, and could we find a place for me? Were there any open positions, et cetera, et cetera. So eventually there was. And in 1998, I moved to Warsaw, Poland, and moved into a little studio apartment because I didn't understand that my New York salary was going to go way further in Warsaw. So I still was thinking I needed to live in a studio apartment. I probably could have afforded a 3 or 4 bedroom apartment with a housekeeper, but I didn't do that. I showed up on day one, and there was an amazing team of Polish folks who were like my age, all of us in our 20s. And there was a guy running the account management, the whole account management team, there, who was a Canadian guy. And very quickly upon my arrival, he resigned and he went to open a bar in Mexico, right? Because this is what people did back then, I guess, is what expats.
It was the 90s. Life was different.
It was the 90s, hard to explain. But anyway, he left very soon after I got there. And so the MD of the agency was a German man, and he said, he said, well, you're running the whole thing now, right? You're running the whole show. So there was more than a dozen people doing advertising, like both account management and the creative stuff, the creative direction and copywriting and all that stuff. And then me, 26 years old, coming from New York. And it was utterly terrifying. I thought, I don't know anything about running a team of, I don't know, it's probably 20 people. I don't know about anything about running a team of 20 people in a country where I don't speak the language, in a culture that I'm not familiar with. I just felt like there were so many things I didn't know how to do. And so that was probably where I had to really be a leader. I couldn't just be the person ticking the to-do list, right? Ticking off the to-do list and just getting things done. I actually had to step away from the to-do list, and I had to understand what all the people did. And I had to act in such a way that I could inspire them to do great work and get the client behind great work and be a good communicator and a good negotiator and all of those things in a culture that I was still learning my way through. So that was, like the typical baptism by fire, but I still remember doing this offsite weekend thing we had in this old country home outside of Warsaw. I still remember it. I can close my eyes and remember all the music and dancing all night and, just having a really good time together as a team. And I remember looking around like, okay, I think this is going to work, and that felt great. But yeah, that was probably my first foray into it. And I'm still in touch with tons of those people. They're great friends. I've gone back to Warsaw 3 times since I stopped working there. I've brought my kids there. So I've written a book set in Warsaw. So it clearly made a big impression on me.
Because you do touch, that's a really important point. And I think, it kind of sits really well with your book, is that you have to have these connections, like these emotional connections with your team to really drive, put productivity to the side. Yes, okay, we all know you need to be productive, but that's not why you go to work. You don't go, I was super productive today. That's like a satisfying feeling. It's doing something with purpose and inspirational and being part of a team. That's what makes it worth it when it's really tough.
Yeah, that's exactly what makes it worth it. And we've recently gotten together, my team at Sage, and I mean, I was so starved for their company because they're most of them in the UK and I'm in New York that I didn't sleep. I mean, I didn't go to bed, and nor did they. Like, everyone was up all night long for 3 days, and we just adored each other's company, and we had such a good time together. And that goes so far, right? That goes so far to caring, right? To wanting to show up. And, they know that I'll do anything for them, but likewise, I know they'll do anything for me. And, I think that if you spend any time doing anything with your team, it's just know who they are as people, right? Mm-hmm. Just start there. And it's funny because we all have a kind of work hat, right? And we all, especially when you're new in a job, you sort of keep your work hat firmly on your head and you don't really want people to know what else you're about. But over time, right, if you're in a company for a number of years, over time the work hat loosens and you have long-standing relationships with people, and that all sort of, you become more of yourself. And what I love is when you can tell someone's work hat is loosening up and they're comfortable, right? That's what I love, because then they're going to be happy, right? Then they're going to come, they're going to log in wherever they go to work, and they're going to be happy because they're with people who make them happy, right? And it's not about the work hat anymore.
Yeah, and I also wonder as well. I mean, I don't know how to prove this. I don't think you can yet. But I have a feeling like with emotions, it's like extra energy is released because you care, because there is that companion love, because there are those feelings that push you beyond like what you think is possible and what you think is physically possible. Those emotions, almost like, you know, in Super Mario Brothers, it's like a little mushroom, gives you that little burst of energy.
Exactly. That's good.
The emotional mushroom. That's what we're going to take away from this podcast episode. I'd love as well for you to share from your research, because you've done such amazing research for the book and everything. What are the trends that you're seeing, like in your space, in leadership development at the moment, or just leadership in general? What are the trends you're seeing?
Well, the A word is huge. Authenticity, authenticity, authenticity. And this is what everyone's talking about. Leaders have to be authentic. Goes back to emotional intelligence and all of that. But authenticity is a huge trend. But I don't think leaders know exactly what that looks like and feels like and smells like and sounds like, right? And what I think was really interesting, one of the things I saw in my research was when you ask CEOs about empathy, they say, and I quote the exact statistics in the book, but they say they know they need to be empathetic, but they believe that people will respect them less if they are empathetic. So they hold back from being empathetic. And so if empathy is part of authenticity and CEOs are saying people won't respect me if I'm authentic, you can see how we're kind of at loggerheads on that one, right? Like there's this belief that it's actually going to hurt me as a leader if I'm authentic. So I think this authenticity word is getting thrown around without leaders either understanding what that looks like and knowing how to achieve it, and B, feeling safe to be able to do it, right? And so that's a huge trend. Sage's CEO is a huge empath, and he's very subtle, I think, about how he does it. But he really cares. You can tell he has the same weight of conviction that Ken Chenault has, and I don't think he knows how much of a fan I am of Sage's CEO, how much of a fan I am of him. But there was a story a colleague of mine told me just recently that she was in his conference room in Atlanta once and not realizing that he was going to actually be in Atlanta. And he suddenly showed up at the door of the conference room, and she was all flustered, and she was like, "Oh, I'm so sorry." And she left the room to give it back to him so he could have his meeting, whatever. And she was like, "Oh, it was terrible. I can't believe I took his conference room." And then later he found her on the floor. He found her and he gave her a box of macaroons. And he said, "I'm sorry, I kicked you out of my conference room."
Oh.
I mean, that's just, that's the kind of CEO he is. And so it doesn't take you don't have to have any big psychological revealing conversation. You could just be a nice person, right? Just start with that, right? Just be a nice person. And the CEO before him, so that's Steve Hare, that story. The CEO before him was Stephen Kelly, and I was at Sage's office in London Bridge one day, and Stephen Kelly cruised by my desk and asked me if I wanted him to make, if I wanted a cup of tea, and if I did, he would make it for me. And I was like, "You're going to make me a cup of tea? Like, you're a CEO. Why are you making me a cup of tea?" But this is a Britishism. Something I learned in British offices, that if you stand up from your desk and you go to the kitchen, you offer to bring food and drinks for people. Well, he just offered to make me a tea, and I was completely floored that he would make that gesture. So, being an authentic leader and being a human leader can be as basic as just being a nice person, right? Just being a nice person, acknowledging the presence of someone else and that someone else might need something or want something. And So it doesn't have to be a whole big revealing thing.
Yeah,
So
no,
that's a good trend.
I
Sorry.
do
Yeah.
agree. No, I do totally agree
Yeah.
with you. You don't have to have researched every article on HBR. Sometimes it's just be a nice person. Like my big thing at the moment, my friend was talking to me about retention, like, oh, it's a big challenge. And I agree. And I said, why do, people need to realise the cheapest, easiest way to retain someone is to say thank you. That was a great bit of work, and tell them the reason why. Costs you nothing. You've probably thought it. It's literally just articulate it. Say it. Like share those things. You don't have to keep it all to yourself. Say that's a great
Yeah.
piece of work. Thank you for making the effort. I really appreciate that. Done.
Yeah.
You're more
Yeah.
likely
It
to
really
retain that person.
Yeah, it really is. I when I had my team meeting recently, I got everyone together, and I knew I was going to be with them in person, and I wrote 45 thank you notes, because I was raised by a Southern woman. And it's all about the thank you note. So I wrote 45 thank you notes, and I wrote personally to them something that I wanted to thank them for doing, right? Something they did, some big project they delivered, something they accomplished, sometimes just their attitude, something they bring to the team that really makes the team better. So I thanked each and every one of them individually with a handwritten thank you note that I put on their plate on the first night we were together. And I did that. I mean, my husband kept walking by me. It took me 3 weekends to do it because I was sitting at my desk, like writing all these notes. My husband kept walking by. He's like, "What on earth are you doing?" And I'm like, "Thank you notes." And he's just like, "I don't know any leader who's going to do that." And I said, "Exactly."
Yeah, exactly. It's not
Evil
doing that.
plan.
It's doing those little things, absolutely. And so we are nearly at the end of our episode today. And I wanted to thank you very much for sharing this time with me. And also, I was delighted to actually spend some time with you in real life in
Yes.
London having a coffee. It was so exciting for listeners. Like, it was just wonderful to meet Melissa in real life in Borough Market, if you happen to be that way, getting a coffee before we did this. So it was just marvellous. So thank you so much for that. But I wanted you to kind of, if you could, encapsulate all your sort of research and knowledge and understanding into 3 top tips leaders need to take away today from this episode.
Yeah, I mean, my first top tip for leaders is just spend time with your people, right? Like you will have demands on you all day long. You will have emails to respond to. You'll have meetings you have to go to and all this stuff. You have to spend time with your people. And I've probably spent too much time with my people. Something I'm sort of realizing with my new fiscal year is like, I probably need to balance it because I need to have more, relationships outside of my team, just to help them. But spend time with your people because lots of things happen that way. You get to know them as both as individuals in the company, as workers, but also as people. They get to know you, and you can exchange information about what they need and what you need them to deliver, right? So time with your people has to be your number one priority all the time, right? And if you're forced to make a decision, go to a meeting with like this person that you've never met, maybe it's a vendor outside of the company or whatever, or have 30 minutes with one of your direct reports, you always choose the conversation with your direct report every time. So that's the first thing, is have time with your people. The second thing I would say is don't fuss with the detail, because when you fuss with detail, I mean, when you're leading large groups of people and you're fussing with detail, you're not spending time with people. You're just in the detail, and you need to trust the people that you've hired. You need to turn the work over to them and have them be in the detail. And when you need to be briefed, they will brief you, but try to stay out of the detail, because the other thing too, that you sap meaning away from people's work if you are in their detail. So you need to just back up from that. You need to make sure they feel the meaning of what they're doing, because they own it and it belongs to them. The other thing I write a lot about in the book is faith, and it's not trust. It's deeper than trust. Faith is I trust you without even needing to be debriefed. Like, I trust your decision making, right? I have full faith that you are going to make the right decision. And it is as far as you can go to give someone that independence and that autonomy and that ability to work and own what they're doing. So So if you're in the detail, you can't have faith. You can't demonstrate that you have faith because they know you're in the detail. They know you see everything. So stay out of detail is a bit of a toxic ingredient, as your leader. So stay away from it. Let other people deal with the detail and give yourself time to be with your people in other ways. And then the third thing I would say, which maybe sounds paradoxical to the second thing I said, is get your hands dirty. People will respect you if they see you digging in the dirt right next to them, right? So choose your moments. It doesn't mean you have to be in the detail, but choose your moment when you're going to get down and get yourself really dirty with the work, because no one expects you to do that, right? They expect you to sort of be at the leadership level and dealing with your sets of responsibilities. They don't quite expect you to sort of kneel down in the dirt and dig it out with them. So find those moments when you can get your hands dirty, when it's going to help you learn, but also help you connect with your team.
Oh, thank you. That's so brilliant. Thank you so much for sharing. And I mean, all the best with the book. I mean, I've definitely been putting in the description box below links to you so people can follow you. And I know you've got a newsletter that I've signed up to that's just brilliant, all about remote leadership. And is there anything else we need to know? Any other ways to connect with you?
No, that's it. Yeah, just subscribe to my newsletter. Everything, book news will all come through the newsletter. So that's the best way to stay up to date. I'm Melissa Romo, author on TikTok. So I am out there doing videos of my remote work habits and practices and my leadership routines and things like that. So if you're curious, follow me there too.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, Melissa. And thank you very much for joining me today. And I'm looking forward to the next time that we can have coffee together.
Me too. Thanks so much, Ilona. This was great.
Thanks.